It may not be apparent that Thales has made great strides in bringing us out of the Dark Ages into the age of science and philosophy, but things got started somewhere, and that is how they got started, at least according to Aristotle, who is our oldest historian of philosophy. But if it ended there, we would still be living in a pretty primitive state. And Thales had, obviously, there were obviously more views. He studied the solar system, he studied astronomy, and he had more to say. Unfortunately, we don't know what other discoveries Thales had made. But from Thales came a student. One of Thales' students was a man named Anaximander. He was also from Miletus. And he too started a revolution, and here's how he started the revolution. In the past, if somebody had a claim that there was some problem with the Hesiod's theogony, Hesiod's theory about where the earth came from, or Homer's description of the gods, how did they decide between them? Who won the fight? How did they adjudicate? How did they judge between the two? Who was right or wrong? Well, whose god was stronger than the other god? There really wasn't a good rational way of doing it. But along comes Anaximander, and he says, he rejects Thales' supposition that water is the material origin, kind constitution, the material principle that accounts for the world. And he gives reasons for thinking that. And moreover, he proposes that there's this kind of entity that makes up all of matter, uses a Greek word apeiron. Now, apeiron, what is apeiron? We're not sure, but it means something like the indefinite, the infinite, or really mostly translated as the unbounded, that has no bounds. And we got to ask ourselves, why does he do this? Why does he make up this other thing that we'll talk a little bit about the characteristics? I mean, one thing is, it looks like this other kind of matter that he's talking about is kind of a conglomeration of everything else that is in the universe, and he's looking for an explanation. Now, unfortunately, there's only one fragment recorded by Simplicius, who's a 6th century, way after this time. You're seeing, almost 1,000 years after this time, and he's preserving an account from Aristotle's student Theophrastus, who's citing what Anaximander had to say. And here's the explanation. And don't get yourself crazy, and don't get your bowels in an uproar. He says, they pay the penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice in accordance with the ordering of time. Very poetic statement. We're going to see our information coming from most of the pre-Socratics is going to be in poetic, very hard to understand, cryptic, secretive kind of language with a hidden message. I guess it came from Hesiod and Homer, who had beautiful poetry, or composed their works as beautiful poetry, and the original thinkers thought they had to compete with them. But we're going to have to take a look at this statement and figure out exactly what it's talking about. And don't worry, I couldn't figure it out myself either. But with the help of some amazing scholars, we're going to see that this really is something that's understandable and makes rational sense. But first thing we should see is what Anaximander is doing is he's pointing out, or he's giving a counter-example, an example to show that Thales' theory is defective, is wrong in some way. And here is the kind of thinking that underlies Anaximander. This is not an argument that he put together, but this is one that I'm proposing on his behalf. And he thinks about it. If water is the origin and composition of the entire cosmos, then it, that is water, must contain all of the opposites. Now, what are we talking about opposites? What are these opposites? Well, think about the opposites. If we think about land, what is it? It's dry. If we think about water, it's wet. If we think you're out a sunny day, we're on land, it's hot. Water is cool. So we see in nature there are these opposites. Well, if water is where everything came from, Anaximander's thinking it's got to contain all of these opposite things. But he goes on to reason, and we're putting this in his mouth. He doesn't say this, it's not quoting anywhere, but it's trying to reconstruct a thought process that would get him there. If water contains all of the opposites, then it contains all of the opposites, including especially hotness and dryness. Right? So if water is, we learned a little logic, hypothetical syllogism, gets us as water is the origin and composition, the material principle of the cosmos, then it contains all the opposites, including hotness and dryness. But think about it. Water, we just said, not hot, not dry. Water doesn't contain hotness and dryness. That's just based on our observation. So, water is not the material cause of the cosmos. Now, we're going to go back and look at that quote that we just talked about, because that quote is going to explain or answer our question that should be coming up. Why can't water contain hotness and dryness? And let's go back and figure out what does that fragment mean, that Theophrastus, Simplicitus quotes Theophrastus, Aristotle, student who's attributing this to Anaximander. And the first part of the statement is, they pay the penalty and retribution. Who is the they they're paying? Well, the opposites. Cold, hot, wet, dry. Go for their injustice. The opposites have committed some injustice. What is he talking about injustice? They destroy, they annihilate things. Destruction, annihilation. In accordance with the ordering of time. What does that mean? That is, the opposites destroy each other in accordance with time. That is, it's not random, it's regular, it's predictable. And Simplicitus' word, just before he begins quoting Anaximander, adds something important which seems to capture Anaximander's idea. Namely, he says, according to necessity, they pay penalty and retribution for their injustice in accordance with the ordering of time. And what does that mean? The process just doesn't happen, but it has to be that way. There's a physical necessity to it. So it's a matter, it's law-like. It's cosmos. There's an orderliness, there's a regularity for the opposites paying, the penalty, the opposites for destroying and annihilating each other in a regular fashion. And Aristotle in the physics helps us out a little bit here in understanding what's going on. For the elements are opposed to each other. For example, air is cold, water is moist, and fire is hot. And if one of these were infinite, the rest would already have been destroyed. But as it is, they say that the infinite is different from these and that they come into being from it. The idea is if any of these individuals was the infinite, it would annihilate, it would destroy all the rest of them, and it would be the only thing around. That's why we need to postulate this entity. That is, the opposites are at war with one another, hot, cold. You know, they're thinking of it as a thing, not as quality. If one of the opposites wins, became infinite, then its opposite wouldn't exist. It would go out of existence. But all the elements that exist are either opposites or essentially connected to an opposite. That is, water is cold, fire is hot. But all the therefore, no element, no familiar stuff can be the original arche, the original material principle. So that seems to be Anaximander's thinking about the material principle.